what's going on? Welcome to today's episode of Art Power. We are going to be reacting to Jacob Holt's Message of Love. He is a Danish photographer who traveled throughout America and took photos of people from every walk of life. The story is rather interesting, and what else do we have to say? Let's get started.
The minute I came to America, I fell in love with the country. And it was not that easy because I was constantly attacked by street criminals, blacks in the streets and so on. But I somehow got curious to see where did all this anger and pain come from. And that made me curious to start going to the ghettos. I think because I myself was a human failure in my father's eyes at one time, that has helped me to understand human failures in others better. Of
He just talked about a key thing here. It's like all of us are humans, for sure. And I'm not talking about this topic specifically in regards to racial tension or racial history per se, but I'm just talking from human to human and how our inability or ability to connect with someone depends on our own understanding of ourselves and our experiences. I was reading a book, I can't remember the title right now, by Adam Smith, I think the author was. And I never made it past the first 10 pages. I put the book down because I felt like I got what I needed from the book. And he just spoke about the inability in a rather, he spoke about in a way that stuck with me, the human inability to understand the suffering or the pain of another person. As humans, we will only be able to think how we would respond if we were in that person's shoes. So Jacob here spoke to the fact that his father looked at him as a failure. So he had that perspective when he was interacting with people and taking these photos. I think that is a key thing to think about throughout this video.
feel attracted to it, and somehow to some of the darker forces in life. Also because I very soon, when I started connecting with all these people, saw how they were rejected in many ways because of their failures by better off people. We constantly hear propaganda about successful people in society, and I reacted against it because, first of all, I was not a success myself, but because we in that way discriminate and don't see the inner beauty in people who have failures because they've been exposed to this or that thing.
I hope I don't stop the video many times, but I like to say here, like, it's important, like, as a human to, from my perspective, I look at every person on my best days. You know, I have bad days too, but my best days, and I try to have more good days and bad. I try to look at every person as if I'm talking to, like, the creator that higher, and it helps me find the beauty within them, you know. I know we've been kind of brought up in cultures that judge people based off many factors, but it's important to talk to a person and get a feel for their story, where they're from, where they've been, where they're trying to go, and make assumptions that you later prove to be true or untrue based on the distance that human has traveled, you know, not figuratively, like what continents they've been to or countries, but just their own personal journey, where they started and where they are now. I think that's a great indicator of the positive characteristics, or not positive, just the characteristics that humans should show, in my opinion, like the resiliency to move forward, the attention to detail, blah 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 blah. Let's start this video.
I started out hitchhiking. Hitchhiking means going from A to B with a goal in mind, and vagabonding gradually came over the years, you know. It's important to remember when you hitchhike from one city to another in America, you get 13, 15, 20 rides in the course of a day, and you sit and talk to all these people all the time. And gradually, I started listening to more and more stories about all kinds of things they had never told anybody before, because they thought that they would never see me again. And often it was deep stories, especially Vietnam veterans who had been terribly abused and lost everything and were suffering from PTSD and so on. And I got so moved listening to these stories. And then they said, after a long talk with them, "Don't you feel like coming home with me so we can keep talking?" So I was sidetracked all the time, so I never got to my goals. And or it took me days after to get to them. And thereby, I gradually learned the role of the vagabond, to say yes to everybody you meet without limitations, even though you open the car door and there's guns and terrible things laying inside and you're afraid of this person and so on. You must consistently say yes, never say no. It takes a while to learn that, because we are all programmed with fear in many situations, and that, as I said, the fear we have from the whites about the blacks. But gradually I learned that my role was as a wandering social worker, something I had actually learned from my father, who was caring for or listening to all people's problems at home. But it took a while before I took that role totally serious. And that is by the time I made the sign touring USA from Denmark instead of these constant destinations. And from then on, America opened up. And I could feel that daily by showing interest in these people I met, and I met them often as drivers who had this need to unload their problems on me. I ended up one day with rich people, the next day with poor people. So my life suddenly was one big contrast traveling, you know, and which is what American Pictures later became known for. And which is also interesting because most Americans don't see their society in these contrasts.
He mentioned Americans don't see their countries in this contrast, but I've had the opportunity to travel to multiple countries and live on multiple continents, and I'd say it's a universal thing. Like, as humans, it's easy for us to, I like to call it zombie mode, and just be on autopilot, only notice the things around us. And I've noticed that everywhere I've been.
I was not looking for anything at the time. See, I had a low self-esteem because I was thrown out of school, and the minute I connected with other people's pain in the ghettos, it was like I got out of my own pain somehow. And also to some degree, my own inferiority, because I could see there was a whole lot of people in this society who had just or even worse inferiority complex. So there my connection also came with the ghetto blacks. I'm not talking here about higher blacks, but ghetto underclass blacks who felt deeply rejected by society. Remember, it was shortly after the civil rights years where everybody expected that now blacks would make it and they should be integrated now and moved into the big cities. But everywhere they moved in the big cities, the whites started moving out, basically sending them the message, we don't want you. So this constant sense of rejection I felt there in a black community, which was also creating problems for me because I was white, mainly because I had learned that all kinds of relationships with whites just spells trouble. And in those years, in the 70s, there was an enormous backlash against the whites, then we don't want anything to do with you. So therefore, if I had not somehow sent them the message of trust and love in there, they would never have opened up to me. Some of those who became my lifelong friends said, until I met you, I had never let a white person inside my home, So there are many obstacles I was up against in those years. But gradually, I could feel that with my Yes philosophy, I developed the role as a messenger between blacks and whites who did not know anything about each other. And that is the time I started developing my small picture books to show white drivers on the highway about what I experienced. And they were moved by them, really moved. And so it was fun because sometimes they would say, wow, those pictures must be taken in the 60s, people living in shacks like I showed them, I said, what? No, I took them yesterday. And I remember one driver, I was driving on 301 down through South Carolina, and he had that reaction, do you want to meet that person in my book here? And then I took him to, you could even see the shack from the highway into Sky Franklin. And he was sitting there a whole day in a shack that were right out of the slavery and was deeply shocked. And this is what I experienced again and again among whites. They could travel in their own society without seeing the pain and misery they actually caused around them with their rejection of blacks. They didn't even see the blacks. The first shack I lived in, I was living with a girlfriend in New Orleans, and then wanted to hitchhike up to see the Angola prison, which had a terrible reputation in America. And that was way out in the swamps, where it was difficult to hitchhike because nobody picks up hitchhikers close to prisons. And of course I couldn't get into the prison. And then I walked up to some people living in shacks right next to the prison. It was also late in the day. I couldn't get a ride out. I didn't know what to do. And that way I came in to stay with Virginia Pate. And what happened was that her son here, Morgan, met me up in another shack, her sister's shack, and he invited me home to stay with them. And I had to share the bed here with 5 children at night. And the next morning I was freezing because the children there were constantly taking off my blankets and so on. So she said to start repairing old quilts so I wouldn't freeze the next night. And I want to say that family has been my family ever since. I remember I was so moved by living with them. I had never seen people live in so poor shacks with no indoor water. They got the water from the roof, and they lived from hunting armadillos in swamps. And the pain I first experienced that way was, of course, the pain of they had to live like this, totally poor and outside society, you can say, in shacks like they had lived in almost since slavery. But the pain also I saw in Virginia's sister's daughter. She's called Virginia Honorum. She's sitting here with her son, Louis. She's 16 at that time. her son was already 2 years old. Virginia here was a grandmother when she was 31. And I've especially stayed close to her over the years, you know. Her son, Louis, there was burned up at one of these stove fires, which I saw again and again when I came back to shacks. The shacks had burned down from stove fires. And out of his pain or whatever, I saw him go to prison for years. This was typically the way they acted out their inferiority complex. They couldn't keep up in school, and when they were told from childhood that they were inferior, and then comes the raids and youth where they act out and so on and go to prison. And this I saw again and again.
I don't want to go through this without making this point. There's this book I read called The Miseducation of the Negro, and it talks about the battle that an African American goes through in the school system, because every subject or every, I don't know how it is now, but when I was growing up, a lot of the history and the people who founded and created things, no one looked like you. So that you can try to not understand, what's the word I'm looking for? You can make an assumption about the mindset of a child, like a kid who's learning the world for the first time. Like what's going through their mind when they're an African American mind that's constantly going to school and learning about creation of the world, the new world of America, and nobody who created anything looks like them, you know? And when you get to certain sections about slavery or history, then everyone looks like you. You can see what that does to a mind, to a child. So the book is called Miseducation of the Negro. I forget the author. I'm bad with names, but I just wanted to make that point here. Like, you should definitely read that book. And if you do, come back to the comments and let me know, like, the takeaways that you got from that book.
That when people are crushed from childhood and told that they're nothing, eventually comes the rage that they act out against society in irrational ways. I was always shocked to see the irrational murders they could commit before they calm down. So the pain takes so many forms, and there are different ways of acting it out. One way is acting it out in crime, but self-destructive patterns is very typical, I felt. I didn't take many pictures the first couple of years because I didn't have this project in mind. So the pictures I took was mostly to remember these people I stayed with. And over the years I became aware of what I was doing, so on. And the fun thing was when I came back to many of them in 78 with my first Danish book, to give them my book, they could not even remember many of them. I had photographed them because I was so discreet about it. I felt the idea was to get close to them, understand them, and feel that I like them and this and that. And the minute I take a camera up, it's like I'm exploiting them somehow and putting myself at a distance. And I felt guilty about that. They couldn't remember. They were so surprised to see, especially to see themselves in a book. And another thing was I took so few pictures because I had no money. I had to hitchhike all the way into the big cities to sell my blood plasma twice a week to get money for 2 rolls of film. So I had to economize. So when I took pictures of them and did it more openly, I would usually sit with my flash and shoot it again and again. Also because I wanted pictures which sort of showed them in the situation I felt they were in when I entered their home, not sitting there posing in front of a camera, which most people do. I didn't want that type of pictures. I wanted them as if I was not there with them. And therefore, I would shoot flash, again and again, until I just got used to that flash going off all the time. And then suddenly, when I sat there later at night and we relaxed and so on, and I saw the deeper sadness, which I had already sensed in them, the deeper pain, that they were dreaming, looking out the window, dreaming or something, then I would suddenly shoot a picture out of those few I could afford in a week. 72 pictures were on each roll of film, and I only had about 140 pictures a week. If I went twice to the blood banks, in their case it was hitchhiking to New Orleans, which was the highest paying blood bank in America at the time. They paid $6.10. Most cities in America only paid $5. So I often travel enormous distances just to get that extra dollar in New Orleans. And remember, it was often a day-long trip to New Orleans, and which also had the complications that it was a very gay city. So I had to, as we hitchhikers called it, pass a gay wall. I knew I'd be picked up by some homosexuals, and there it's important to remember they were totally rejected themselves at the time. And I therefore felt deep compassion with them from the beginning, and sometimes let them do what they wanted to do, but not not direct rape. I had been exposed to that one time, and I didn't want to go through it again. So what I did on these trips in the cars with them was I tried in different ways to satisfy them, and that usually was enough. Or just have talks with them about their deeper pain, about being Christians and not accepted by the Christian church, about being rejected from their families, especially if their families knew it and so on. So I had deep compassion with them, and just the fact that I listened to their stories and they could feel my compassion meant that I could usually talk my way out of the most exploitative situation. Remember, I had the philosophy never to say no. And how I'm not gay, and therefore it was a battle for me. How can I avoid getting too? Also because it took time. I wanted to go around and meet other people, and it took time to get through all this abuse. I remember one trip from Winston-Salem to Greensboro one time. It's only 25 miles long. I was picked up by 3 gays in a row, one after another, and I let them do what they want to do. That's another thing about my hitchhiking. I always felt when I was deepest down and being abused and let myself go through exploitation and so on, I was somehow always rewarded for it. As I said, you have to go through hell to get into heaven, And that example with the truck driver David Lanker there on Highway 55 in Mississippi, when I came back from New Orleans, is a good example of it. And he kept saying on the trip, if I didn't want to go with him into the woods, the endless woods there in Mississippi, and I kept talking around it. I want to go up and see the flooding in the Delta in the northern Mississippi, but I couldn't get myself to say no. And so eventually I just said, okay, let me get it over with, And then we went into the woods, and he did what he had to do. I remember before that, he had said, then I'll put you up with a very rich lady tonight, I didn't believe him at all, but so it was not that. But anyway, after he came back to the highway, he drove me to Natchez, to this old Gone with the Wind town of plantation homes all over the town. And took me in to the woman who owned one of the plantation homes, Emily Kelly, and then I ended up staying with her for weeks and become her lover instead, and had black servants to serve me breakfast in canopy bed. And people always ask me, how did you get into these plantation homes? I never could tell the whole story because for years I was not too honest about that side of my traveling. But when I came back in '78 to show my show in America, the rumor had already gone all over the country and gone down to them. So when I came back to see Emily and show her the pictures from that time, well, they knew about it, but she had killed herself in the meantime. She was deeply unhappy, and her servant found her in a bathtub where she had killed herself. I've seen my pictures analyzed so much over the years, and I never understood them myself, As I've always said, you can't stage people living densely together. They run around. You just can't say, do this and do that, But there's one exception, and that was Earl and Bert in North Carolina, in Tarboro. When I lived in their shack, I lived in a room next to theirs, and through the cracks in the woods in a wall, and I could hear it, I saw them making love in the kerosene lamp, And I thought it was such a romantic picture I could take there. So I wanted that picture, and I asked them next day if I could do it. No, they were good religious people. They were embarrassed about this, and so on and so on. Anyway, I felt I must have that picture because it was so romantic. Then I hitchhiked to California, and then I wrote them a letter from California that how much it would mean for me to have such a picture. And they said, okay. And then I hitchhiked all the way back for 3,000 miles, and then they allowed me to take a picture of them making love. In some ways, it was staged because everybody knows that they don't make love when the photographer stands there. But it was that picture I had seen through the cracks in a wall that they were doing that night. That's how close I became with people. And that became one of my more famous pictures. People who see my show and my book often have misunderstood my relationship to black women, because there's a few naked pictures in the book, but actually I had hardly any relationships to black women. Let me try to give an example of this with Mary. I came hitchhiking out to her shack out in the woods in Alabama and asked for a drink of water. It was stifling hot that day in August, and she has since said how afraid she was of me. And again, I could win people over eventually and ended up moving in with her. And there I took the picture of her half naked in bed. And I want to say what happened after that was, after some time, I wanted to hitchhike up to see a Ku Klux Klan meeting up in Louisville, and went off, and she's giving me a silver cross to protect me on the journey. And then when I came back, some whites had firebombed her house because she had a relationship to a white. And ever since then, when that section is in my show, I've been blamed about exploiting, taking advantage of a poor black woman, just because of that intimate picture of her in bed. The truth was that we both felt a deep attraction for each other, but she had a white boyfriend, a landowner, who came every morning at 5 o'clock to have sex with her. And this is what we call nighttime integration. And this is what I found out, how many local poor black women were taken advantage of by rich or better off white men in return for giving them something. So for that reason alone, I couldn't have a relationship, even though we both wanted it. Over the years, as I came back, I saw her when he died, she would get a new one, and I would meet and photograph them together with the new white boyfriends. They knew she had this relationship to me, so they accepted me. Local rednecks and so on. And through her, I met a whole network of other black women who had their own white exploiter, I would say. Something that went way back to slavery. And it was still going on in the South like this, you know. And when I was getting too close to her, I could feel that this was going down into the deep historical, not going back to slavery when they were abused and taken advantage of by white men. And I didn't want to be one of these exploiters, you know. And just that held me back. But remember also, especially among more northern, liberal black women, you know, they were held back for other reasons. They were under social control. It was absolutely forbidden to be married to a white. I mean, Leslie, my girlfriend for years, we wanted to marry. And her parents, they loved me. I would go around and eat with them all the time. But just the idea of your daughter marrying a white, no. You know, you must not associate with the oppressor in that way, fraternize with them, you know. Remember, it was in the years where whites moved out and forced millions of blacks into ghettos. And as a result, their houses became worthless. Houses they bought often for $1 by fleeing whites. The whites made themselves richer and richer out there in suburbia, in the attractive neighborhoods, you know, but in the process made the blacks poor and poor. And what happened with Leslie's father was his tailor shop was burned down, and he couldn't get loans. He had no insurance, etc. So he lost everything. So of course he did not want his daughter to marry one of those evil whites who had caused them so much pain. Remember also the inequality this has created. When we flee somebody we don't like or don't want to go to school with, we make ourselves richer. So I saw the whites out there over the years become richer and richer. In those years I made American Pictures. Every white in that way had made themselves 6 times as rich as every black. When we go out in something that becomes attractive in neighborhoods, you know, the housing values out there get artificial higher and higher. And then we can take loans in our mortgage there and send our children on trips around the world or to Harvard and for the money, you know. And gradually we make and start investing the money we make that way and make ourselves richer and richer. And while we make those, we flee poor and poor. Their houses become worthless, they cannot take loans in them. And that was a picture in those years. Every white had in that way made themselves in assets 6 times as rich as every black, you know. Over the years, under Bush, it was 8 times as rich as every black, you know. And finally, they had gotten so much money out there in suburbia. Where should we invest that? Well, then came Goldman Sachs and invented something called subprime loan. And that was in around year 2000. And who was it who got those loans? That was especially some of the black families that had struggled themselves up in a middle class. When then the financial crisis came and they sat with these worthless loans, they lost everything and rushed back into poverty again. And after the financial crisis, every white person in America today owns 20 times as much as every black person in assets. But this is a racism which has worsened over the years, and I've seen my black friends gradually become poor and poor, relatively speaking here. But it's very difficult today to photograph, as I did it, because all the boats have been lifted a little since then. Now blacks live in trailers maybe instead of shacks. So when I say that racism is worsening, it is the proof that we have made ourselves richer and richer that way. I had a difficult relationship with poor whites at the time in my hitchhiking years. And I think it came from my knowing how they were abusing blacks all the time, that I had prejudice against them, also because they were shooting me down as hitchhiker and all that, So all the pictures I have of poor whites are very sort of distant. I didn't get close to them at the time. But then when on my first return trip to America, I picked up a poor white hitchhiker and got him in the car, and I immediately sensed that he had been exposed to incest. This is something you learn very quickly to see the signs and so on, and got him to talk about this, how he had been raped by his father in childhood, but he had always excused his father, and that often becomes the most dangerous racist, those who put the blame on somebody else instead of the real source. And so I gave him all the help you can on a highway there, just speaking with him. And you have endless hours for that on American highways. And as a result, he was so grateful because most abused children like this, in better off society, we don't like them. They radiate negativeness or all kinds of weird feelings, and that child who has had endless love in childhood, they become extrovert and they loving people, and those we love and give more love to. But the oppressed children, we don't like. So nobody had ever talked to him really about all this. And he was so grateful. And this is what I experience every time I give that kind of just therapy, talking to them, that they become so grateful. They'll do everything for us afterwards. At one point, I showed him my book with all these blacks in, and he said, "Why don't we have anything about the Ku Klux Klan? I'm, in fact, a member of the Ku Klux Klan." He had not told me at that point. He didn't need to, because I knew typically that was the story. And then, "It will mean so much for me if you come to one of our meetings. Please, won't you?" And that is how I got to my first Klan meeting, simply giving therapy to a poor incest-ridden hitchhiker on the highways, And I immediately, when I saw the open gathering of them there in Alabama, felt deep sympathy. I could see most of those who stood around there. There was an open recruiting meeting for everybody. Had been abused more or less in the same way, deeply painful background in most of them, But that was before the evening, the cross lightning, as they call it. And he had promised to take me out to the cross lightning for only members, so therefore I had a white dress on and so on. But before we went out there, I gave him a meal, in a restaurant. This is, for me, payback time. I got so much love from Americans in those years. I hitchhiked around. They constantly fed me and so on. Now, when I had come to money, I try to return the love by feeding the people I pick up on the highways and so on. So when we sat there eating in a restaurant, I said, don't you want to call home your mother on my phone card and tell her that you have arrived well and so on. Then a little later, when he came back from the phone booth, I could see his whole face was contorted by anger and pain and so on. And then he told me that the mother had just told him that his uncle had just been shot by two blacks, killed by two blacks, you know. From then on, I thought, can I now trust him? Dare I now go with him into the woods with 60 crazy Klan people in the middle of the night with machine guns when he knew that I was anti-racist? This is what the Ku Klux Klan call a nigger lover. Would he now betray me to them? He had promised to help me take the film and hide it, etc., etc. Would he now betray me? But, so I was so afraid that I called my family in Denmark. If I am not called back before midnight, you must call the police, you know. But I decided to trust him anyway. Went with him in the woods, and he never betrayed me. So what I learned at that experience was that all people in pain, and he was now in double pain, both the incest in childhood and now the loss of a dear uncle, all people in pain have more need for our love than to express their pain in the form of violence and anger, you know. I then started working with the Ku Klux Klan in 2003, years later after this, you know. And of course, this is not the same people who did the mistreatment of the blacks at the time. Remember, the civil rights murders they did there at the time and all the other murders the Ku Klux Klan did at the time did because the white society encouraged them to do it, to take a stand against the northern states who wanted to force integration down their heads, you know. Most whites were nice and polite and they wouldn't do it that way, but they encouraged the Ku Klux Klan to do the dirty job, you know. So the Klan acted politically correct in the 60s. When I did that, politically correct, it was encouraged by the whites, and they were not sentenced for it at that time. The sentences came years later, you know, including those in Mississippi burning, you know. And to defend Ku Klux Klan as human beings and try to understand them as human beings, as I've been doing by working with two of the biggest Klan groups in America, and then putting it on the net. Well, some blacks who will see that and don't go deeper into it and just see my pictures and he's a friend of the Ku Klux Klan, of course they'll be offended, you know. Therefore, it needs more explanation. And this is the difficult thing nowadays with the internet, that people don't get deeper into stories and they just judge people on the surface and so on. But some people who understood it was the Virginia Page family. And I remember saying, you have always been the most loving people, you and your husband, accepting everybody abroad with me. What would you say if I brought the biggest Klan leader in America with me? And they said, we would love him just as much as all the other friends you have brought here, you know. Okay, by the way, I have a Klan leader sitting out in my car right now. Can I bring him in? Bring him in. And that was an amazing evening. They immediately hooked up, you know. And Virginia Honoré and her husband, I mean, you can see it in the pictures. They loved each other, you know, and actually had many similar viewpoints about being against integration, you know. Virginia didn't want her daughter, who had a white boyfriend at the time, to marry him and all that stuff, you know, and they were in complete agreement, and that is what I see whenever I go to Klan rallies. They'll stand and yell and scream and say terrible things at these cross burnings while their black friends stand in a ring out in the forest and laugh at them, and the next day I see them go hunting together as I've always done. And the blacks know that this is all they're blowing steam because they're in pain or whatever, you know, and they have a deep friendship with each other in most places. Not in the North, that's a different thing, because they have lived in isolation from the Klan, and therefore it's easy for them to just reject them as evil people. When people meet each other, they can always connect. So all my life I brought people together. The richest woman, one of the richest white women, bring them, all my university students, bring them into the black ghettos to meet my friends, you know, to overcome the fear they have of them, you know. So my mission here was to try to change. It was just an experiment. How fast can you change America's biggest Klan leader at the time? So I took him around to all my black friends to meet them and so on. And it changed him. Afterwards, he went home, dissolved the whole Ku Klux Klan, and it almost cost him the life, because then the other Klan members were so angry that they tried to kill him, including his own son was helping to kill him, and he was laying in coma for 2 months. The doctors didn't know if his life could be saved. When he woke up, he was handicapped and blind for life, but happy. Since then, I saw him preach love in a church instead of hate in the woods, you know. I didn't see any difference in him. It was the same guy. It was just a different way for him to express the inner love he always had, but which had been deeply oppressed in his childhood as a result of the exploitation he went through. All people in pain have more need for our love. And this has been my guiding force ever since, you know. Whenever I have dealt with Ku Klux Klan and terrorists and mass murderers and so on, all of them need our love more. And that is the only way to stop their violence, that they meet our love.
Self-love, it all starts with self-love, you know. Beauty will save the world, definitely. I truly believe that. It starts with falling in love with
I grew up
yourself.
in a rural western
It starts with falling in love with yourself so that you can love others, definitely. One cannot exist without the other.
part of Denmark. My father was the minister of the church, and I should also have been a minister. The first born in my family for 5 generations had always been named Jacob Holt and was a minister of the church. But it was not really me. I always slept in church, you know. The only thing I paid attention to was when he said Jacob in the church. You know, nobody was called Jacob out there. And that was, of course, the story about Jesus and the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. And that moved me so much that Jesus went in there, got in dialogue with those outsiders, the Samaritans, and that has inspired my life ever since. So always I've had tried to go into the forbidden areas and so on. But that was long before, and I was then kicked out of high school for ADHD in my second year, so I couldn't become a minister. I couldn't go to university. And shortly after, then I got involved in the anti-war activities in the Vietnam War, and there was a warrant out for me, and then I escaped to a Canadian family in Canada, where I worked on their farm for a year. And afterwards, I wanted to go down to Latin America for pure adventurism, and Canadians had told me so many scary stories about how dangerous it was to hitchhike in America. But the minute I came to America, I fell in love with the country. And it was not that easy because I was constantly attacked by street criminals, blacks in the streets and so on. But I somehow got curious to see where did all this anger and pain come from. And that made me curious to start going into the ghettos. And it was only when I was attacked enough time, that especially the first 2 years, that I started moving in and live with some of the better behaving black students in universities, that I learned to not see them as monsters anymore, but as people I could have trust in. And gradually that way I built up more and more trust, sort of a whole bank capital of trust. So when I now went out in the street and met all these street criminals, and without knowing it, my message to them was totally different. You're okay, you're totally in order, you know. And that for them was a message of love, because they were used to seeing whites flee at a big distance. I'm not saying I'm a loving person, but just by learning to trust black people, instead of listening to all these voices the whites had planted in me, I could give them the message of love which they were craving for. And from that minute on, black criminals and murderers and even mass murderers took me by the hand and sort of dragged me through their world of pain. And since then, I've never been attacked anymore, even though violence has increased tenfold since then. And that is when I developed the identity as a vagabond. A vagabond is one who consistently says yes. If somebody picks you up and says, no, come with me home, you know, you don't go to New York if you want to go there. No, you go with him home to Texas. And gradually, over the years, I have developed that into vagabonding in the...
I don't know, but it seems like this is like a repeat of what was said earlier. Maybe misjudging, but what do you think? Like, have we heard this part? Maybe not in detail, but I feel like this is a repeat.
Fourth dimension. I realized again and again when I returned to my friends I had photographed that I had not understood them, or had still some prejudice against them somehow in my pictures and so on. And only by following them over the years have I then started understanding their lives and discussing their lives with them after my book came out, and they could point out, no, this was wrong and this and so on. So I've constantly been corrected by the people, and that I have many great stories about following people for life. Already the first year I sent a lot of letters home to my parents about what I experienced, and I think they didn't always believe me because it was incredible experiences. And gradually I learned that a camera, you can record all this so you can remember these people later. So that's just a much faster diary. That's how it started. And my project only started much later. The project which came out to be called American Pictures in Denmark. American Pictures is a document, but it's a one-sided document. I've always felt it was wrong by the Danish papers to call it American Pictures because I felt it's un-American pictures, pictures we don't like to see ourselves. It's one side of America. America is much more than one I show, so there's already there a generalization which was popular at the time in Denmark because everybody was so anti-American at that time and so on. But the last 2 years of my vagabond years, I could feel that this was turning into some project and became more and more professional about it. And one breaking point came in '74 when I saw a slideshow in a university with 2 images at the same time. It was about coal miners and just very primitive, and I thought, wow, fantastic way of showing all the contrast I experienced between rich and poor and black and white. And that is where the idea of making a slideshow came from, I had already on the way home sorted out 15,000 slides after topic, and in no time I made this slideshow in 2 months, which ended up lasting for 30, 40 years in American universities. And in no time, a publisher came and said, can we make this into a book? And that book also became a bestseller. All the money should go to Africa in the support of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. I ended up presenting my slideshow American Pictures 7,000 times in my life, especially the Ivy League schools for the privileged people to a high degree, were open-minded to it. And gradually I developed the workshop the day after, because I had so many questions at night, I couldn't answer them all. Come back tomorrow, and that way my workshop developed. And actually there I learned myself more about racism than I ever did in my vagabond years, that hurt the deep fears of blacks and all that stuff. And I would say over the years my slideshow changed a little bit because I felt much more sympathy for whites, learning the deep pain which was behind their racism in general, because they'll stand up and talk endless stories, not least the rich children, about the hurt they have gone through when in childhood they developed a deep love for their nannies, black nannies, but very soon sensed that this was forbidden love, to love the blacks. And they could remember when suddenly their parents unexpected came home and saw them interacting that way with the nannies, they would suddenly freeze with guilt. And that kind of pain, that guilt, that developed in them, they carried with them all their lives. So even the most privileged children in America, I found, were in pain for their racism and expressed it in these workshops. So that was a learning experience for me. And seeing their shock, because they've written me also endless letters about how it changed their lives. And now they sit in high government positions and or high positions in society. I said always to them, you can't do away with your racism once it is sitting there, but be anti-racist racist. Be solidaric with blacks throughout your lives and acknowledge your own racism and act on it throughout your lives. One typical response I've had in universities is often suddenly a black woman, when I have questions, will stand up and yell and scream at me. And I learned over the years to listen to what they were saying. Instead, I try then to defend myself, but this is the wrong thing. Fold my arms and let them blow steam, because I know the problem was they start attacking the messenger instead of the message and so on, and I am the white messenger. But this is the difficulty blacks have. They sit there in most universities alone and feel hurt by, is this how all the whites will look at me now? The accusation of exploiting people, I never really heard over the years. I think out here today, because the climate has changed very much. I even think today, and I try to see today, if I, as a white speaker, could have survived so many years on American campuses. But they listened because I was white, and said the same thing as so many of the black speakers had said during Black History Month and so on. And for that reason, I survived that many years in America, because it was a white man who came with the same anger about this exploitation blacks were subject to. Unlike somebody who just makes a speech, but I had all the pictures to show it with. So, but I'm not sure in today's world that I would survive for that same reason, because nobody else has made pictures of the exploitation of blacks like I have. And I would also say the accusations about making a poverty circus out of it and so on. Yeah, I called it a show for the same reason, to let the audience ask themselves the question, is this just a show for us? Entertainment about the poor in society. So I bring up that question again and again, also where a lot of self-accusation in the show. And for that reason, I didn't hear the accusations in all those years, because I constantly in the show talk about my white privilege. Even though I was poor and came from a different country, I knew that I was privileged compared to those who had not been brought up with such a happy upbringing as I had. Looking back over the years, I can see that my Christian background must have helped shape me in different ways. Maybe I must have listened more to my father than I thought. I had seen my father act out that love with the poor people in or the people in his parsonage, caring for them, listening to them, and so on. And which I must say, he did so much of that somehow, as a child, I felt neglected. And people have analyzed, because I didn't get my father's love so much, because he spent so much time loving his congregation, is part of the pain I was in when I came to America, and therefore thought his love all my life and so on. And interesting, then history goes in full circle, because I have spent most of my life on highways in America teaching American students about love, but in the process neglected my own children in Denmark. So they didn't feel their father's love, which is a problem for them. I'd also say one thing I always said, many ministers teach love in the church, but they forget to act it out, you know. And it's more the action of love than the talk of love. And I think they would not have opened up to me, American students, if they couldn't see or sense that I had acted it out in real life instead of just preaching it. It's easy for ministers all over the world to talk about love, but what they forget to teach us is what oppression is, to practice love to those who have been exposed to oppression, or how it is difficult for all of us who have been oppressed, and in my estimate, all of us have been oppressed in different ways, how difficult it is for the oppressed person to act out in a loving way. I think most people would do that automatically, but we're held back by so many ways we have been oppressed. If they had been brought up in a free society with free love between blacks and whites, they would not act like this, you know. But they had not. I could come with the first year rejection of Southern whites. Why do they do this or that? But from the minute I learned how they had been oppressed in such ways, I could only forgive them all in my thinking and love them. And as a result, they loved me back and carried me around. For the $40 I brought with me to America for 5 years. Where in the world could you do that, I would say? Because people who feel loved open up everywhere in the world. And the minute we can learn to love other people. So it comes in from here, not from any message that you should love people. No, it comes in here. Then the world opens up and you are carried around the world. And it's such a beautiful world then. And that is our hope in these times.
Such an interesting story, interesting perspective and photos. These photos actually brought back memories. Both of my parents are from Alabama. I don't want to link them to the photos that we've seen here, but I remember driving from Georgia to Alabama, and right now I'm having like memories. I don't know if they're true because I had a car accident, so a lot of my memory is faded, but I think I kind of remember conversations about not driving at night or going through certain towns at certain times and not pulling over if the police get behind you unless you're like in a busy area or store with lights, These memories just came back to my head. But thank you all for tuning in. Let me know anything interesting or interesting perspectives that you had thought of while you watched this video, and until next time.